Hello, everyone, and welcome to Rebellious Unknown, where we make the unknown, the good, the bad, and the ugly known. My name is Lynn Hurley, and I am here with you at least twice a week to discuss what is happening in this big, crazy world of ours. And if you like talking all things politics, please join the rebellion by subscribing, and don't forget to hit that notification bell so you can be notified anytime we have a new show coming up. All right, so we're going to get right into it. Today, we are going to be watching a hearing at the Oversight Committee, the risks of progressive ideologies. Hi, Chris. So I believe it might even be starting up. Nope, hasn't quite started yet. I thought I heard something, but doesn't look like they're up there yet. So we will have it up and ready to go as soon as they start. It's supposed to start at 10, so should be here soon. So this is going to be talking about President Biden having the military incorporate more progressive ideologies and how that has affected the military. Has it been good? Has it been bad? We'll definitely hear about it, I'm sure. So that is what is going on today. Hope you guys are doing well. Um, Also, let me know when I start it up how the sound is. It should be pretty good once we get it connected over. I think it should be fine, but always just let me know how it's going. Hey, Snoopy, how are you? Nice to see you here too. I'm so glad to have you guys here with me bright and early this morning. It should be another good one. I don't know if any of you watched any of the Hunter Biden hearing from yesterday. I watched a little bit of it and gotta say, it's a spicy one. It is a spicy one, so we will definitely have to watch that one together because I was dying in the first 10 minutes. I heard Nancy Mace telling Hunter Biden, who showed up for at least the first few minutes, that he had no balls. And Mr. Garcia said that he said the words dick pic in the committee hearing. So it was a spicy one. So I haven't watched it all. I don't even know how long it went. It was still going. It was over 6 hours at that point. It was still going. So I don't know how long it went for. We're gonna have to look and see. So it might have to be a two-parter. I don't know. Let's look and see. While we're waiting, let's just check it out and see how long did that go. In fact, let me double check. Nope, they still haven't started yet. So you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna pull that up so that we have it going. So that when it does start, we'll already be right here. I'll make myself a little bigger while we're talking right now. Let's see. How long did it go last night? I think it was it the same committee? I think it was. It was either that or the judiciary committee. Uh yeah, it went almost 8 hours yesterday. Oh my goodness. Can you imagine? Can you imagine what it was like to sit in that room? And what a PR stunt of Hunter Biden. That's crazy. He just came, he sat, they had seats up front. So was it planned? Did someone on the Democratic side have those seats saved for him? He was asked what type of crack he smokes. So he got up and left right as Marjorie Taylor Greene started to talk. And yeah, the reporters were asking him some pertinent questions, shall we say, on his way out. So that was an interesting one. They did ask him what type of crack he smokes. They also said, "Hey Hunter, why were you talking to your dad in your business meetings? What was that all about?" So he was like, "Well, when your dad calls, don't you answer?" No, not if I'm in a business meeting. I don't would be the correct answer, but not Hunter. Apparently, he drops everything and then includes his dad in the meetings just so his dad can say hi to all of the people at the meeting. But it was a crazy one. Yep, it absolutely was. I'm going to pull this up. And let's talk a little bit about what this meeting today is going to be. Let's see, does it have anything? Who are we going to have? Witnesses and testimonies. Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Lohmeyer, I believe. And then they're going over a document there's Brigadier General. There's a Brigadier General and a Mr. Will Sibo. who they have 2 documents. I don't know if those people will be there. It looks like there's only the one witness perhaps. Um, but they have a couple of documents that they might be using, or that are on the website that you can see. Let me double check that you can go in and see those. Usually you can. Yes. So, okay, this is a written statement. So it doesn't say that this person is a witness, but maybe they are.
This hearing on the Subcommittee on National
Okay,
Security of the
here we
Border and
go.
Foreign
It's
Affairs
starting.
will come to
So let's
order.
see what
I'd like
happens.
to welcome everybody who's here. Without objection, the chair may declare a recess at any time. And without objection, we are honored to have the Representative Waltz of Florida wave onto this
Let me know how
subcommittee
the
to share
sound
our
is.
military experience. For the purpose of questioning the witnesses at today's subcommittee hearing, I recognize myself for the purpose of making an opening statement. Good morning. I want to welcome everyone to this hearing before the Subcommittee on National Security of the Border and Foreign Affairs. Today's hearing is the risks of progressive ideologies in the U.S. military. I want to express gratitude for our witnesses for being here. It's my sincere hope that this hearing provides a platform for constructive dialogue on the issues that face today's military. The questions we intend to address today are not just about readiness or the military's personnel system, but how ideological concerns and debates within civil society are imported into and impact the military's ability to recruit, train, and especially operate effectively in a dynamic threat environment. The term wokeness has become a topic of discussion both within and outside military circles, is prompting us to scrutinize how ideological shifts may impact the readiness and effectiveness of the armed forces, as well as uh, how our military is affected once they begin to adapt this kind of woke ideology. Our military is grappling with the Biden administration's social experiments of integrating principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or what's referred to as DEI, into their ranks. The Pentagon often failed to recognize the financial burden these priorities place on taxpayers. DEI managers are making over $180,000 a year, which in my mind sends a message in its own right. In fact, the Department of Defense recently requested $114 million for diversity and inclusion initiatives as part of the president's fiscal 2024 budget request. Unbelievable. To be clear, acknowledging the various experiences of our service members may have
I like the
the potential
commentary.
to enhance our overall
Unbelievable.
strength and resilience as a nation and fighting force. At the end of the day, our differences must yield to what we have in common, a duty to protect the American freedoms we hold dear. I have concerns about how the DEI bureaucracy implements its framework within the military. Not to mention, I think the DEI framework is not something that is even necessarily true. I think it unnecessarily divides people instead building up uniform, building up cohesion. It has the potential to harm unit cohesion and undermine our sailors' effectiveness. Between this and our Secretary of Defense being incapacitated for several days and not telling anyone, shows a concern about the seriousness with which the Biden administration leads our armed forces. We need to understand the influence of progressive ideologies on military policy and whether progressive ideologies are even true. We need to understand the extent to which ideological considerations are shaping decision making processes. Our armed services have long been a bastion of meritocracy, whereas where individuals are promoted based on their skills, competence, and dedication to duty. It's crucial that we examine whether the emphasis on an ideological framework is affecting the core principles of a merit based military. Furthermore, I think it's important to examine uh, whether this DEI ideology is even factually true or whether it just serves to divide Americans. In today's hearing, we aim to understand the implications of these ideological shifts on military readiness and effectiveness. Our witnesses will provide insight into how these ideologies may influence training, operational procedures, and overall cohesiveness of our military units. This hearing is an examination of how ideological considerations, even well intentioned ones, erode the fundamental principles that have historically defined our military and ensure unit cohesion and force readiness. I think throughout our history, our military understand that we are fighting for, I think, the greatest country in the world. And I think all of our soldiers and sailors ought to understand that. Our focus is to ensure that our military remains a beacon of excellence while adapting to evolving needs of our nation and threats we face from our adversaries. It's about leveraging the full spectrum of talent within our nation for the cohesive strength of our armed services. Thank you again for appearing here today, and I look forward to the discussions that will unfold in today's hearing. I now recognize Ranking Member Garcia for the purpose of making his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'll just be honest, and I am a bit dismayed and disappointed to be here at this hearing today. Back in March, we held a hearing called Ensuring Force Readiness, Examining Progressivism's Impact on an All-Volunteer Military. And back then in March, I was dismayed that the majority chose to ignore what I believe are the root causes and challenges we're facing to recruitment and retention in our armed services, such as the need for improved mental health support for our service members, the continued need to implement the I Am Vanessa Guillen Act and the need to crack down on sexual violence, the need for reliable and affordable child care for our warfighters who are deployed on a moment's notice, and so much more, especially when our economy is creating record numbers of jobs in the private sector and our military has to compete for top talent. Now, data and evidence show that sexual assault, mental health care, affordable child care are all real factors that affect military recruitment, retention, and readiness. During that hearing, many of us stressed that to recruit from the most diverse generation in history, we also need a military that looks like America. We need a cohesive military which does not allow bigotry within its ranks. But the hearing also found that attacks on military leaders and family hardships may be significant factors in dissuading otherwise motivated young people from pursuing military careers and, of course, depriving our country of incredible talent. The idea that, quote, wokeness is a top national security threat did not make any sense then and does not make any sense today. And it makes even less sense now given the world that we face. Now, I believe that overemphasis on this far-right talking point is what inspired Senator Tommy Tuberville to launch his unprecedented blockade of military officer promotions. Now, Senator Tuberville intentionally blocked more than 400 general and flag officers within the DoD from Senate confirmation and promotion. Even more junior officers lost the opportunity to rise in rank, with massive impacts on factors such as retention, pay, pension, and future opportunities. The stunt did far, far more to undermine our military readiness than anything else. And so I asked unanimous consent to enter into the record once again the letter I sent calling for a hearing on national security implications of the senator's blockade of military promotions into the record. Thank you, sir. Now, I can't really understand why we're also holding a second hearing on this topic when we could be working on it in a bipartisan way to address real challenges to our national security. And Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for our bipartisan work on our UAP disclosure bill. And I think that's the kind of bipartisan effort that we should be working on today. We should also be talking about our real national security threats. Our allies in Ukraine need immediate aid. We need to support Taiwan and provide aid, of course, in the Middle East. Now, we could hold hearings that use data and evidence to demonstrate that Americans' aid boosts our national security at minimal cost and highlight how our aid safeguards democracy and freedom against brutal aggressions. We could even show how Ukraine aid directly benefits communities all across our country who benefit from investment and jobs, and drive how these investments will uphold our national security in the long term. But instead, we're holding Ukraine and other crucial foreign aid hostage. Instead, many are debating that we bring back indefinite detention for children at the border, defund Catholic charities, and end the right to asylum, linking that to aid that impacts our national security. Some also appear to be using Putin's talking points that want to sell out our allies and partners. There's obstruction, of course, around issues around the border, saying that we don't want bipartisan border security actions. And one of our congressional colleagues even said the quiet part out loud, and I'll quote, "Let me tell you, I'm not willing to do a damn thing right now to help a Democrat or to help Joe Biden's approval ratings." That's not the type of bipartisan work that we need on this issue. And yet here we are investigating wokeness. Now, it's not wokeness that is threatening our national security, whatever that word actually means. The real threat to our security is a far-right extreme obstruction of dysfunction and culture war stunts. This hearing is disappointing, but I look forward to working with our chairman and hope there can be bipartisan solutions. I yield back.
I'm pleased to introduce our witnesses today. Our first witness is Will Tebow, Director of the American Military Project at the wonderful Claremont Institute, where he works on analyzing the institutional integrity of the U.S. military. He also has experience serving in Iraq in the 75th Ranger Regiment as a platoon leader and company executive officer. Next witness is Matt Lohmeyer, former U.S. fighter pilot and former commander with the U.S. Space Force. He's also a best-selling author and consultant on defense-related issues. Our final witness is Ty Sajudli, a retired U.S. Army Brigadier General and professor of history at the U.S. Military Academy. He's also a visiting professor at the Hamilton College, and in 2021, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin appointed him to the National Commission on Base Renaming. I welcome each of you here today and look forward to your testimony. Pursuant to Committee Rule 9G, I will have the witnesses please stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record show all the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Thank you. You may take your seat. We appreciate your being here today and look forward to your testimony. Let me remind the witnesses that we have read your written statements and will appear in full on the hearing record. Please limit your oral statement to 5 minutes. As a reminder, please press the button on the microphone in front of you so that when it is on, the members can hear you. When you begin to speak, the light in front of you will turn green. After 4 minutes, the light will turn yellow, which means you have 1 minute left. When the red light comes on, your 5 minutes have expired, and we ask you to wrap up as quickly as possible. I now recognize Mr. Tebow for your opening statement.
Good morning, Chairman Grothman, Ranking Member Garcia, my fellow members of the subcommittee, and my fellow panelists. It's my contention that the military must only consider factors of personnel, programs, and policy that genuinely better the armed forces' ability to fight and win our nation's wars. Merit must not be the first consideration for this analysis, but the exclusive lens through which elected officials and military leaders make these kinds of decisions. Diversity is an ideology that exists in our social mores as something that the military must embrace as a point of fact, as a principle, as opposed to just a byproduct of selecting the best people for the job. It's as if the armed forces march to the beat of a corporate or university drum. In reality, though, the existence of a professional, permanent, standing military demands that the institution exist apart from ideologies and politics prevalent in modern-day America, regardless of their political affiliation. And therefore, the military must balance functional considerations, again, those capabilities required to fight and win wars, with social considerations, or those political and ideological realities which define American life for the rest of us. Increasingly, though, objective military professionalism is now seen as one factor among many that allow leaders to, quote, comprehensively evaluate a person, system, or policy. This, of course, being a euphemism for innate characteristics like race or sex. This programmatic consideration of these innate characteristics is toxic because it redefines the concept of merit-based standards. When diversity goals exist for military units or the service academies, standards become minimum expectations to meet before fully evaluating other parts of a participant's career or life. Standards are no longer how the military selects the best based on an order of merit list, but just how you get in the door. The mere factor of political considerations outside military competence demands that human characteristics one does not choose about themselves become critical filters for military decisions. Consideration for diversity is one mark of the blend that the old historian Samuel Huntington's Military Mind made, with the hallmarks of a society that are built around different ideals than that which makes the military successful. Despite the Army's current recruiting slogan, the military is not a place where you can be all you can be. Instead, it should be a time of service and a career for our nation where one gives all there is to give, no matter the cost. Our military is filled with men and women who live by this principle, but our policies and slogans should reflect this ethic of service. At stake, though, is much more than the relative quality of military units. The integrity of our republic is in tension with a military that evaluates matters of politics and identity. When standards become minimum expectations, they are not markers of achievement to select the best. In other sectors of society, the consequences of shirking the exclusivity of merit amount to a bad hire in the finance department or the wrong university president, maybe a missed revenue projection. that last fiscal quarter, but the military is and should be different. History is littered with examples of militaries whose consideration of political ideology precipitated a collapse in military professionalism, led to defeats on the battlefield, and all of which served as a precursor to the collapse of those nations. America should not wait to find out if we can outrun the drumbeat of such history. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Lohmeyer.
Good morning. My name is Matt Lohmeyer, and I'm an Air Force Academy graduate, former F-15C fighter pilot, and was a lieutenant colonel and commander in the Space Force. In 2021, I was fired from my command for writing a book trying to reverse the trend of the overt politicization of the uniformed services. Specifically, I criticized the military's diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings, which at my own base were illegally occurring despite an executive order from the commander-in-chief. The diversity, equity, and inclusion industry is steeped in critical race theory and is rooted in anti-American Marxist ideology. I watched DEI trainings divide our troops ideologically and in some cases sow the seeds of animosity toward the very country they had sworn an oath to defend. Before writing that book, I submitted a formal written complaint to the Space Force Inspector General's office detailing that such violations were occurring, including illegal race-based discrimination, but my complaint was never investigated and was later dismissed by then Lieutenant General Stephen Whiting, whom the Senate just confirmed for his 4th star. After 2 months, I received a written dismissal of my complaint from General Whiting. Personally, I have always advocated for a non-political military work environment. Today, I'm here to testify about the ongoing Marxist-inspired efforts to subvert and weaken our military and broader American society. We often refer to these efforts as wokeism, but it is also a culture war. Yet even in this committee, there are differing views about whether there is such a thing as a culture war underway. Some members of this committee have been outspoken critics of DEI initiatives to include CRT, drag shows on military bases, trans activism, LGBTQ pride celebrations, and woke military recruiting videos, all things that are visible components of an ongoing culture war. Ranking Member Garcia, as he just mentioned, on the other hand, and asserted as recently as 2 weeks ago, says that the culture wars are quote-unquote phony and are merely a political talking point of Republicans. It's nothing if not incredible for a member of this subcommittee to assert that culture wars are phony, while another member, who's not present at the moment, of this committee is a member of the so-called Progressive Squad, was herself a Black Lives Matter organizer and activist, an organization whose publicly avowed ideology is Marxism, and whose activist ambition is social and cultural revolution. Service members who wear the uniform of their country do not want to see these things in the military workplace. They don't want to see them at their bases. In most cases, this is true regardless of their race or their political worldview. Despite that reality, Pentagon officials requested $140 million to expand woke diversity initiatives in fiscal year 2024, double what it's been the previous 2 years. There are few things taxpayers such as myself feel less essential to the mission of the United States military than expanding diversity mandates and indoctrination. And now an important point. Such aggressively opposed ideological worldviews competing for institutionalization through policy epitomizes and formalizes what is properly termed a culture war. The fact that these debates now infect the U.S. military workplace is an offense to people like me who love their country and all people regardless of their race, gender, sexual preference, or background. I'd like to briefly draw attention to 2 of a handful of exhibits I have submitted for the committee's review and for entry into the official record of today's hearing. The first is a 100-page document which includes real-world, unsolicited feedback from military service members. I submit it for the record because to spend even a few minutes with the document is to get a sense for how DEI trainings are hurting morale, dividing and distracting troops, disincentivizing Americans from service, and thereby destroying our recruiting and retention efforts. The second is a letter signed by 185 retired general and flag officers previously sent to leaders in the House, which they did in fact receive. Despite their warning about DEI's divisive impacts in the military workplace and their request for Congress to end funding for all such initiatives, the Congress ultimately did not use its power to put an end to DEI funding in the recently approved NDAA. Thank you to those of you, by the way, who tried to introduce useful legislation. The men and women who sent that letter raised the warning voice and tried their best to respectfully influence our nation's lawmakers. I said in my book back in 2021 that if we did not abandon the diversity and inclusion trainings, then we would see unprecedented recruitment and retention woes. That has been true, and we have seen as a nation that it is not getting any better, hence the need for a hearing like this. I also said that unless we abandon our present hate-filled and divisive path and repent as a nation, we will destroy ourselves, and I reaffirm that view here today, and I'm grateful to answer any questions that this subcommittee may have for me. Thank you.
Chairman Grothman and Ranking Member Garcia and committee members, thank you for the opportunity to speak to the committee. I served in the U.S. Army for 36 years. My wife is an Air Force brat, daughter of a fighter pilot. During our career, she supported families in peace and war. For that entire time, we lived on Army post and one Navy base, raised our two boys. My son, Peter, who is with me today, served in the 1st Cavalry Division. We are an Army family for life. I have 3 points to make today. First, the United States Armed Forces are the best in the world because we reflect and represent the greatest country in the world. Diversity is the military's strength because diversity is America's strength. Second, the military makes significant social changes primarily when Congress demands it. When President Truman ordered the military to desegregate in 1948, it didn't really happen until the 1970s when Congress demanded it. The military reacts to Congress, not the other way around. Third, the military's half-century commitment to equal opportunity and diversity has created a more lethal, effective, and cohesive force. In 1971, the military was falling apart. Race relations were at its nadir and drug use at its peak. Over the next 20 years, DoD instituted and internalized a culture of diversity that transformed the military. Diversity has worked for over 50 years. For the last half of my career, I taught history at West Point and studied the history of our Army. In fact, I brought for both the chair and ranking the West Point history of the Civil War that we wrote while I was there. In 1948, President Harry Truman issued Executive Order 9981, integrating the U.S. military. It couldn't go through Congress because segregationists blocked civil rights legislation. Without laws, the military slow-rolled integration. The last segregated military unit disbanded in 1954. In 1963, 10 states still had 0 Black National Guardsmen. As late as 1969, Mississippi had 1 Black National Guardsman, not 1%, 1. In the 1960s, the Army had 3% Black officers, and the Navy and the Marine Corps 0.2%. Black service members could not rent houses outside some bases. The children of Black service members still went to segregated schools as late as 1969. By the early 1970s, the effect of the Vietnam War, drug use, and racial prejudice had created a broken military. The quote-unquote race problem threatened our ability to defend the nation. In 1971, senior civilian leaders created the Defense Race Relations Institute. They mandated race relations training for the entire force. Recruiting for the all-volunteer force forced the military to integrate and to try to solve the race problem. It worked imperfectly. Less than 20 years after the defeat in Vietnam, the U.S. military shined again. In 1991, during Desert Storm, we destroyed the 4th largest army in the world in days, and that army had 31% African-American NCOs. The success of equal opportunity policy saved us after the defeat in Vietnam, created the all-volunteer force, and led us to victory. I know I commanded a diverse cavalry troop in the 82nd Airborne Division during the Gulf War. By law, women weren't allowed to serve in tank, infantry, and cavalry regiments for most of my career. It's just un-American and ineffective. When the Army deploys, it fights on land, and 8 billion people reside on land, 51% of whom are women. We must have women in the force at all ranks. At West Point, I taught a cadet who was unable to follow her dream to be an infantryman. While she was a Rhodes Scholar, the combat exclusion ended. She rebranched infantry, graduated from Ranger School, and commanded an infantry company. She was the toughest, brightest cadet I met in 20 years. When I commanded a battalion, we suffered under Don't Ask, Don't Tell, a policy that forced service members to lie. A friend deployed to Iraq. Her partner and their children could not access military facilities. No commissary, no health care, no child care. Now, because Congress ended Don't Ask, Don't Tell, we have another proud military family. In both my experience and my study of history, diversity policies, equal opportunity policies are neither progressive nor political. They are proven national defense strategies that have made our military more effective and our country safer for over 50 years. Thank you again for allowing me to join you today in the People's House.
I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes. We're going to start with Mr. Tebow. As you mentioned, the Department of Defense is requesting another $114 million for DEI initiatives. This is addition to $90 million already dedicated. We mentioned that these DEI professionals are making well into six figures. Is this bureaucracy necessary? Could you comment on it? What do they do?
It's a good question what they do, Mr. Chairman. The problem I have is the policies that result from such a bureaucracy. And there is, like you alluded to in your opening remarks, a lot of well-intentioned training, perhaps some of which is necessary. But what is not necessary are race and sex-based quotas that are prevalent in at least two branches of the military. And if it's a bureaucracy that serves to fulfill those policies that I think do more than simply educate people about bias or promote equal opportunity, but in fact promote a system of race and sex-based discrimination, that's problematic, and they shouldn't be receiving any money. And so we should be thinking about those policies that are more than just the promotion of diversity, but are actually an alteration to the personnel program in the military.
Have you seen people promoted? Not if Mr. Lohmeyer wants to jump in, he can as well. Have you seen people promoted or led into the military academies who are not the most meritorious because of this DEI ideology?
So, I never impugn someone's promotion or their selection. I take, a person that wears a uniform with the integrity that it comes with. But what is problematic is when West Point, for example, has racial goals for every admissions class. And admissions leaders are evaluated whether or not they meet race-based goals. I don't know what the difference is between a goal and a quota. And to me, we should do more to perhaps promote cohesive teams without implementing a personnel system that again alters the nature of how merit defines personnel policy.
Good boy.
Does
Good
this
point.
ideology create a mindset in which people view themselves as members of a subgroup or identify based upon where their grandparents or great-grandparents were born?
Perhaps. When I was in the Army just a few years ago, we got training on our conduct and how it was unacceptable to harass someone, to harm someone. And it seems there are some examples where there is now training on what you believe and how you've.
Could you
how
get in
you've been
trouble
raised.
by boldly pushing an ideology based on merit? Would that be a check against you think, in the military today? Well, Mr.
Perhaps
Lohmeyer wrote a book on it.
Yeah. I think he'd be better suited to speak on this. But I know I've heard from a number of friends and folks who want to speak out that there is a pervasive concern about speaking out for the genuine integrity of merit as the foundation for military.
Right. I recently talked to somebody who wanted to leave the military because of this ideology. We'll go to Mr. Lohmeyer. Do you feel promotional decisions are being made primarily on diversity as opposed to pure merit in today's military?
I do not think that promotion decisions are being made writ large based on solely diversity for the purposes of diversity. I think that we've got tremendous leaders in the military overall. I think that we still care a great deal about merit, and that these policies that we're here to discuss today, however, do muddy the waters, and we do establish quotas. And I want to provide one example that Will just commented on that I experienced while I was in command in the Space Force. I had young people, underrepresented groups, that means non-white, coming to me and expressing their dismay and what was the word that the ranking member used? Disappointment, that they could no longer tell themselves. I don't know what their political affiliation was. I don't know what their religious worldview was. I do know what their ethnicity was. And they came to me expressing their disappointment that, hey, look, my entire career, I've been promoted based on my skill, my ability to execute a mission, and I'm not sure moving forward whether or not I'll be able to tell if I was promoted based on the way I look, my accidentals. And I can provide a lot of examples of that kind of thing going on. I can also tell you that we've had a failed pilot training experiment as recently as last year, the American pilot training class. It was in 2021, actually, in which we chose those selected for that pilot training class in Texas based on their gender and their ethnicity, so that we could make the pilot training class look more like the United States of America. That didn't turn out well. And so we should look into that as well. But
Could
we
you
tried
quickly say what didn't turn out well?
well, performance suffered. And that's the point. I as an instructor pilot in the T-38, I trained young men and women from our allied partners and from foreign militaries. Like the general here, I served with foreign militaries. I did an exchange to the People's Liberation Army Air Force Academy in Changchun, China, when we still did that. And I'll tell you, we do have the best military on the earth. It's because there's a naturally occurring diversity in the Defense Department especially that we allow in a merit-based selection system, promotion system, and so forth, so that the best can be placed in these various positions that we hope they will use to execute a mission in defense of our country.
Thank you. Okay,
Exactly.
Mr.
If we want to
Garcia.
truly be diverse, then let people earn things based on their
Thank
merit,
you very much, Mr.
not on
Chairman.
any other
Thank you to our witnesses
qualification.
also for being here. General Seduli, thank you for joining us today. I appreciated your testimony especially, and I want to thank you for the decades of service, of course, to your nation. I want to start by just getting a few facts out of the way quickly. I'm sure that anyone who saw the movie Oppenheimer, which was my favorite movie of the year, is familiar with the Red Scare. And obviously you as a historian also are familiar with the Army McCarthy hearings, which seem to be replayed over and over again in this House. I'm disappointed that some of my colleagues also seem to want to replay those hearings and those scare tactics. But since you're here, I just want to ask you very clearly, is the military being destroyed by Marxist ideology?
No, it's not. Excuse me. No, it's not. And I don't really even understand how you can say it's Marxist. At least I studied Marxism, and I don't understand how it relates at all.
I agree with you, sir. And in your experience as a professor also at West Point and in your 36 years of service in uniform, did you see any evidence of leftist indoctrination?
No,
How about of critical race theory?
no,
Have you ever seen Antifa infiltrating our military?
no.
Well, thank you, General. Now, I'm sure we can all feel a bit better knowing that there is no large communist menace or Antifa or others plotting to overthrow the U.S. military, which we know remains the strongest in the world. And we all, I think, in a bipartisan way, agree that we have the best military in the world and that we're very proud of. Now, General, in all seriousness, can you explain why policies that promote a military that reflects the diversity of our country and allows everyone to serve no matter who they love, one that protects female soldiers from harassment, and actually promotes and improves our national security, how does that actually reflect, how does that improve our actual military?
Thank you, Congressman. I really believe that we look at a period before we had this, which is the 1960s, and see how terrible the military was. And the military imploded without that. And if we have an army, that's what I'm familiar with, that has right now, over 20% African American, and yet have almost no leadership in that role, then we're going to have problems. We don't have quota system. I was on the admissions committee at West Point. We don't have quotas there, but we do want to make sure that that we look like our client. Our client is the American people, and we want to make sure we reflect that. I have found that diversity policies make us a stronger nation and a stronger country, and I'm unfamiliar with anything that make diversity policy somehow is going to melt our brains.
I would much
in
rather
some way when
have
we take that.
someone
It's
in a
not been
position
my
of power
experience.
who has earned
and
it
I would
based
agree.
on their
It's
ability,
clear that a more
not the way that
diverse
they look,
military
regardless
is
of
good for
what
national
color they are.
security and is good as a reflection of the whole country. And I think the question is do we want a military that actually reflects the entire country? Yeah, as an LGBTQ American myself, I also understand very clearly that it wasn't that long ago that an openly gay person, an openly person from my community, could not contribute their talents in the military. But it's been changes to policy and implementation that have made our military more reflective of who we are as a society. And so I appreciate your comments. General, can you remind us about some of the challenges our military has had to overcome as it relates to segregation?
Unless by not that
as it
long
relates
ago,
to racial
he
tensions
means,
within
what,
ranks?
over 30 years
Yes,
or so?
remember, we were a segregated army really into the 1970s. We had very few cadets at West Point. We had only 23 naval midshipmen in 1970. That's 0.5%. We continue to have very low levels of general officers and in the Army and in all services into the 1990s and beyond. So we have always had a problem making sure that the Army leadership or the military leadership reflects the enlisted ranks. And when we don't do that, we have problems. And we saw that in the 1960s and the 1970s. It's the same thing with other underrepresented minorities. But remember, it's this body that changed it. It ended Don't Ask, Don't Tell. It brought women to West Point. It ended the combat exclusion. Congress is the one that did that. Congress is the one that really changes the military.
And General, would you agree that it's been, like you said, it's been laws, it's been the intervention by Congress, it's been policy changes that have actually had to have been forced sometimes on the military to actually improve diversity amongst its ranks?
It's only been that usually. We did not integrate when there was an executive order. It was only when Congress did in the 1973 Equal Opportunity Act that really started that and put equal opportunity people in every battalion in the Army.
And so I think it's pretty clear that in order to achieve a military that reflects the rest of the country, Congress needs to push and create action. And I appreciate all the efforts that have happened in the past to actually create a military that reflects the country. And this idea that we should go backwards or that we shouldn't embrace diversity, to me, is totally insane and crazy. Finally, what actually poses a bigger military threat to national security? Policies to promote cohesion and tolerance and diversity within our military, or a historic disruption to officer promotions caused by Senator Tuberville's publicity stunt?
Senator Tuberville, I think Senator Sullivan probably said it best on the floor. Why punish people who seriously sacrifice for America? Why punish patriotic military members over a policy dispute they had nothing to do with and can't fix? This is a huge readiness challenge and a huge morale challenge. And yet, amazingly, not one member of those general officers ever made a public complaint about it. It shows the professionalism of our General Officer Corps that no one made a complaint despite the disruption and cruelty of that policy by Senator Tuberville.
Thank you, sir. And again, I reiterate that that's the hearing we should be having, is on that enormous disruption that happened in the Senate and how the House can help rectify that. Thank you, and I yield back.
Ms. Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Lieutenant Colonel Lohmeyer, thank you for your service and for being here today. In 2021, the United States Military Academy, West Point, taught cadets critical race theory through a seminar titled Understanding Whiteness and White Rage. At an Armed Services Committee hearing earlier this year, or last year, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, was questioned about teaching critical race theory at the service academies. General Milley defended the practice, saying he thought it was important for those in uniform to be, quote, open-minded and openly read, end quote. He went on to state, quote, I want to understand white rage and I'm white, end quote. In your experience as a squadron commander with the U.S. Space Force, would learning about whiteness and white rage help promote unit cohesion or a team-centered culture?
The answer is anyone who's focused on warfighting doesn't naturally think to talk about these things in the military workplace. We're focused on a particular mission in defense of the country to deter conflict and to win our nation's wars. I do want to make one additional point, if I may, that the general has just explained that he never saw critical race theory in his time at West Point or in his lengthy honorable military career. In doing research for my book that got me fired, I found that West Point cadets who had recently graduated. These are impressive people, black, white,
How his book got him
clearly
fired.
leftist
I
in
think
their
we all need to
political
read that
worldview,
book.
had produced a
See if I
40-page
can find
policy
it.
proposal, is what it was called, that I consider a communist screed, anti-American, race baiting, accusing leaders at West Point of failing the American people, criticizing West Point as an institution for racism, criticizing them for failing the Army, and that they would continue to fail the Army. What I found in that document is that this general's work is quoted throughout the entire 40 pages. So you can't say that you've never been exposed to critical race theory when a bunch of left-wing Marxist-leaning students attack the West Point Military Academy relying on your work. And so I'd be curious to find out if they consulted with him in the production of that 40-page policy proposal to topple statues at West Point, to rename buildings. When that kind of invitation came to me as a commander to rename streets and buildings, everyone at the base was allowed to populate the Excel spreadsheet that came to us as a tasker from the Pentagon. And I saw George Washington's name on that list because ideology that poisons the mind doesn't disambiguate between racists, evil men, and good men, and
I-
patriots. What they did is they said, he is a founder, he's white, I hate him, and we'd like to remove his name from buildings and streets. This is the kind of thing that ideology does to the military. It divides people. And the best evidence we've seen so far, 10 more seconds, is the recent testimony from university presidents who tried to excuse and contextualize genocidal rhetoric. And what CRT, diversity, equity, and inclusion mandates, and Marxist ideology do to a university president or to the Chinese PLA, they will do to an American service member. And I've seen it firsthand.
Thank you. I think it would be wise for the committee to follow up on the report that you're talking about. So I hope we'll be able to do that. According to the Department of Defense website, its mission is to, quote, provide the military forces needed to deter war and ensure our nation's security, end quote. Do you think that teaching our future military leaders about whiteness and white rage will better prepare them to deter war and defend our nation?
No, I do not.
And do you believe promoting divisive concepts, you've, I think, indicated this, like critical race theory, have an impact on military recruitment and retention?
Well, I've got some polling data here that if we have time, I can cite, but this is one of the prevalent themes that shows up among active duty service members who have been polled about their concerns about the direction the military is headed, why they're choosing to leave the service, and young Americans, why they're choosing not to join. They sometimes call it wokeness, that's colloquial, but they specifically, if they know what they're talking about, refer to critical race theory, and if you know what you're talking about, you know that it's rooted in Marxist ideology.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter to the record any document that Mr. Lohmeyer has, such as that survey in the minutes of this hearing.
I can, I'm sorry. You didn't ask me to speak.
No, well, I'm just going to ask one more question. Are there specific recommendations you have for maintaining a strong and cohesive military culture while addressing concerns about ideological influences?
Yes, ma'am. I think every American citizen, veteran, or having never served, looks to the Congress to use the power of the purse to hold our military accountable. But we also need brave men and women in uniform to respectfully give feedback, use their voice, and stand on their principle. We don't all have to agree, but we do have to agree that the mission of the United States military is paramount. And merit-based selection and promotion is the only effective principle to keep a strong military. I don't care what people's views are on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I really don't. But we can't use our individual political or social or cultural worldview to shape military selection processes of all institutions. The long-trusted U.S. military must remain a merit-based system. Otherwise, you'll lose that system.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Goldman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to see if we can find some common ground here. Mr. Tebow, I heard you say a little earlier that you support diversity as at least one variable to focus on to either admit in the service academy, students in the service academies, or officers evolving. Is that officer promotion? Is that right?
What I said, Mr. Goldman, is that I am willing to accept and support diversity as a byproduct of good military policy. It's not something we should, certainly not something we should avoid, but it's not something that the military should cater policies to promote. That should
do you
be
think
military
that
effectiveness.
do you think that
God,
diversity
Mr. Goldman.
of backgrounds is beneficial to the military?
As it relates to a person's ability to do a job in the military, yes. If something doesn't, if a capability doesn't exist in the military and we need someone with a more diverse
That's true, but
background
then
to
that's
do
where
that
it should
job,
be
then
addressed,
yes, it's
not
important. But
forced
what I
on
don't think that
everyone.
means is that a person's skin color is relevant to those jobs. You know, in the House
So,
Armed Services.
I hear you, and I'm going to just follow up on that. I mean, because I think there's some contextual things that we need to talk about here, because you and Mr. Lohmeyer are talking about merit-based, and focusing on that. But you know, when you look at the history of discrimination in the military, what you have to consider is that everybody does not start from the same place. So Mr. Sedgerlay's family growing up with a general in the military has advantages in terms of entering the military that someone whose family does not have would not have. You agree with that, right?
Yes.
Okay, so if the military was segregated, if non-whites and women were not allowed, if
But it's not.
the LGBT community, because of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, were not allowed, you therefore understand how those people from those different groups are not starting at the same place in terms of evaluating, quote, merit-based, right?
But Congressman, I think that's a false binary. The choice is
Exactly.
not between discriminate against non-whites and, choose anyone.
I'm
but the
not
best.
talking about discriminating. I mean, there are only a certain number of people that can be admitted to a class, that can be promoted. And if you're basically saying that you cannot consider anything else other than what you call pure merit, and there's no definition for pure merit, you are necessarily perpetuating discrimination that has occurred for generations.
No, not
And
necessarily.
when you start to see things such
Oh my God,
as
I can't stand this man.
government reviews, the Air Force independent review that said 40% of, in 20 and 21, 40% of Black and African American service members indicated a lack of trust in their chain of command to address racism, bias, and unequal opportunities. You are necessarily not acknowledging, not addressing what is a fundamental problem, not only for retention, but also for promotion. And if women are leaving the service 28% more because of sexist culture, family planning, or sexual assault, that has to be addressed. That you cannot, I do not believe you are sitting here and saying that it is okay. You mentioned something about you support training on harassment, but if there is implicit or explicit racism or discrimination, you would agree that has no place in the military, right?
Of course.
Okay. There needs to be training because a lot of people don't know what that means. And they often don't know that what they are saying is actually discriminatory. So there needs to actually be training so that everyone from every walk of life in this country can have an opportunity to participate, to represent our country, to be in the military. And the problem that we run into when we try to say purely race neutral, merit based, and once again, we're obviously talking about a disproportionate number of white people primarily who are in positions of authority, who are elevating people, who are admitting people. If they are not trying to address some of the historical wrongs to give people who have not had that access to the military, to this opportunity, give them that opportunity, then we are just going to perpetuate the historical discrimination for forever.
No, you know
So
what
I'm not
perpetuates
saying
the
merit
historical
doesn't matter. I
discrimination
think
is
it
when we
absolutely
continue
matters. And
to
I
do
certainly
things
understand Mr.
based on
Lohmeyer's point that
race
we do not
or
want to put
based on
people who
sexual
are
orientation,
unprepared in
whatever.
bad situations.
That's what
But to simply say
continues
that
discrimination.
diversity should have no impact whatsoever on our military will continue to perpetuate a discrimination that is unfortunately embedded in our military's history. And with that, I yield back, Mr.
It's
Chairman.
because he's an idiot. That's why.
Mr. Perry.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman and gentlemen. God bless you for your service. I really, really appreciate your sacrifices on behalf of this nation. As often is the case, my position here up on this dais is my 5 minutes. Most of it will be spent correcting, in my opinion, the record of the things that have been said previous, as opposed to the questions I might have asked each of you. So I'm going to go through a couple things here. And maybe it's not only correction, but it's clarification of the record, as I would like to say it. Sure, Mr. Seidel, is that how you say your name? Sidgley.
Sidgley.
Sorry about that. My
My
apologies.
mother got it wrong for years.
I'm sure the name tag was probably difficult. I just want to make the remark and the point that the segregationists that blocked integration were decidedly in one political party. And I think it's important to note that because they will be up here acting like they never did that. And it's important for the historical record as a fan of history that that you can appreciate that there are consequences that America cannot forget and should not forget. Regarding diversity, I hear that all the time. Diversity is our strength. Diversity is our strength. And it's, Mr. Thibault, you just answered a bunch of questions about that. And it is a strength when we have different viewpoints about how to solve a problem. But if we're all in a rowboat, there's 4 of us in a rowboat, and we all have a different idea of where we're going in a different oar, diversity is not going to be much of a strength, right? We're all going to be rowing in 4 different directions. So diversity is a strength, and we're all pointing in the same direction. Otherwise, it's not a strength. And I don't know how that can be refuted, but if somebody wants to, they're welcome to do that. Regarding the comment that there was a defeat in Vietnam, I want to make sure, because I grew up during that time, as you did, I imagine, sir, just gauging from seeing you here, it was not a military defeat. It was people like Walter Cronkite and other leftists and political activists in the United States of America that imposed that defeat. And it's important to me. I revered my uncle when he came home from Vietnam in his uniform as a guy who served and the sacrifices he made, and it colored my decision to join the military. And it's important, again, for the record, to remind Americans that the military did not lose that war. That was a politically lost war, and I don't want that to be attributed or ascribed to the military. Regarding the McCarthy hearings, I want to remind everybody in the room that while I disagreed with his tactics, as most Americans did, if they read Whittaker Chambers' book Witness, and if they go through the Venona transcripts, almost every single person he named was a communist sympathizer, organizer, and involved in the subversion of the United States government. Let's not forget that. Regarding those folks that were held up by by Senator Tuberville, and the fact that they didn't complain, well, good for them. Because when we wear the uniform, yours is not to question why, yours is just to do and die. And we don't talk about political things because it is against the regulation. So they weren't doing anything grandiose. They were doing their duty as they should. And Tuberville was doing his duty as he should. The policies in the military regarding the subject at hand are wrong. And thank God somebody was willing to fight for them. There is a specific definition for merit. I would ask my colleague, he can go look up any search engine and see it. I joined the military, and I love my time in the military. It defined me, and I defined it. And it was based on merit. And I didn't have a leg up. I knew my uncle who served in Vietnam, but when I raised my hand as an E1, no one knew anybody I knew, and it didn't matter. And I love the fact that even coming from a broken home with no connections and no clue about anything, I could work my tail off and make something of myself. And even though I didn't have my commander's recommendation to go to officer candidate school, I got into officer candidate school, and I became the president of my class. And even though I didn't have a recommendation to go to flight school where you're measured within 1/10 of a point, I graduated second in my class alongside soldiers and service members from the Air Force Academy and West Point, of which I was not allowed to go to because I wasn't good enough. And I wasn't good enough. But the point is I worked my tail off because it was based on merit and I could make something of myself. And while I complained to myself, I didn't complain to anybody else when I tried to get an inter-service transfer from the Army to the Air Force, because instead of flying Cobras, I wanted to fly F-16s. And a friend of mine, he got to go. He was a black man. But when I applied to the same unit, I was told, sorry, you don't fit the position. You know what I did? I got after my job as a Cobra pilot. I got after my job and I went on with my life.
I didn't cry my eyes about it. There's a bunch of people that are up on this dais today that are going to complain to you and tell you about your life in the military who have never served and don't have a damn clue about any of this. But Mr. Lohmeyer in particular, Mr. Thibault in particular, God bless you for your viewpoints and your willingness to sacrifice what you have for the things that you believe in, because you are correct. Our military is being destroyed right now, and we all know it. We all know it. And while I wish and I hope that it still remains the best military in the world, I'm not sure that that's the case anymore, and we better damn well come to that realization and get after that. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Thank you. Good points. Mr. Frost.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I just want to point out to what my colleague just said, as it relates to members of the United States military whose promotions were being held up because of a senator who had problems from an ideological point of view with bodily autonomy. The message to them was, ours is not to reason why, but to do or die. But then to a gentleman here who did complain and fight, wrote a book about his issues, the message was completely different, which I think shows the hypocrisy in this room right now from the other side of the aisle. I'm from the state of Florida. This war on wokeism is not new to me. And it's a shame that Republicans on this committee haven't caught on to my governor DeSantis' failing presidential campaign that's based on this war on woke. And this misplacement on wokeism in the military endangers America's national security by ignoring the real threats. Some of the real threats to our national security are low military recruitment and retention rates, which is what I want to focus on today. Look, service members aren't leaving the military because of DEI training, or because a military base was renamed, or because someone accessed an abortion. But what I do hear from my constituents is this. I've had folks write about problems with housing allowance being too low in the military. People messaging me about saying medications are too expensive. Folks worrying that service members won't be able to get pay if Republicans in Congress shut down the government. These are the real things that resonate with the American people, because these are the issues that this committee needs to be addressing. General, you testified that the Army became more diverse and welcoming to soldiers of color over your time in service. How has that inclusion helped retain talented service members?
We have a greater, thank you, Congressman, we have a greater pool to draw from. We didn't used to be able to draw from people of color or women, or if we had LGBTQ, they were kicked out, of which I know many that were kicked out. We have a broader thing. We need every person to be able to serve. And we can't do that if we are trying to kick people out or not allowing people to serve and not make it welcoming. We're a better Army because of our diversity.
I 100% agree with you. I mean, we know at West Point that Black students had highlighted during their time the art memorializing the traitor Confederate General Robert E. Lee that hung on the wall, and the fact that the only Black person hanging on the walls was someone who was a slave. And I think that things like that hurt our military readiness and national security when it makes our service members uncomfortable.
If it hurt our
Diversity,
military,
equity,
then
inclusion
why were there
strengthens
almost
our national military? It
200,000
does not work against
Black
it.
military
General, you've also
servicemen
testified about
in
your
the
own
Civil
story
War,
of
making up
service.
10%
Quote, I didn't choose the
of the
Army
soldiers that fought in the
because of
Union Army?
patriotism. I
If it was
signed up
that
for the money,
horrible,
end quote. And I
why
don't
did
bring
they
that
serve?
up as a disparaging thing, because we know that this is something that is true for many of our service members. And especially when I speak with folks who look like myself in my community that are looking at joining the military. You joined to help afford your college, and ended up staying for more than 4 decades. So thank you so much for your service. We know that many soldiers enlist for financial reasons, but then choose not to re-enlist because it's unaffordable for them. Have you observed any trends around how economic struggles can stunt a soldier's career?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, I particularly think that's true because our soldiers now deploy or actually rotate so often to Eastern Europe, to South Korea, and to the Middle East without additional money for that. And so if you're doing 2 9-month rotations to one of those 2 places, plus National Training Center or other things, it's incredible, difficult, particularly for the family at home, because they have no great childcare options.
Yeah, yeah, and I would love to host a hearing about that instead, to see how we can handle those struggles. Since at least the 1940s, Congress has given the United States military money to create signing and reenlistment bonuses to incentivize service members to join and stay in the service. General, do you think the military should be collecting data on why and when bonuses are helpful so we can better understand the financial hardships of our service members?
Yes, we have been doing bonuses at least since I've been in, and they work because just like I was a poor kid coming from rural Georgia, I had no way of getting through college without it. Those financial incentives matter in an all-volunteer force.
A second thing that this committee should be hosting hearings on to figure out how we can better our national security and military readiness and preparedness. Look, and I know we have Mr. Lohmeyer and folks who have had uncomfortable or maybe negative interpretations or experiences with DEI, and I would never take away someone's experience from them. But what I do want to call out is there's a difference between seeing something that you see value in, diversity, equity, and inclusion, or diversity in our military, and saying we ought to fix these problems. I think there's some problems with it. I think we ought to fix them, versus saying we should just completely get rid of it. I mean, in 1954, when we began to desegregate schools in this country, we knew it would be uncomfortable. We knew there would be problems, but we did it because it was the right thing to do. This hearing is entitled "The Risk of Progressive Ideologies in the U.S. Military." DEI is not a progressive ideology. It's just the right thing to do. If we want to talk about progressive ideology in the militaries, we can talk about affordable housing and food. We can talk about tuition assistance. We can talk about universal health care that the military provides, progressive ideologies in the military, but not DEI. Thank you so much, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank our panelists for being here today. I joined the Army in 1988, began boot camp in 1989 as private, one station unit training, wanted to be an MP. That ended up working out for me. But one of the initial lessons that you learn very quickly when you step off of that bus and you have to face these guys that are carved from granite and wrapped in leather, tapping that brown round against your forehead, is you are no longer you. You now belong to the United States Army. To discuss diversity as if it was ever some sort of an effective mechanism by which a deadly force could be established to fight and win wars across the world, to liberate the oppressed for generations, is insane. We don't care about anything other than the deadly effectiveness of our Army. It requires discrimination, because developing deadly skills in a force of men requires us to recognize distinction, to discriminate between those who can become lethal weapons and those who cannot. Nobody cares about your color of your skin, your cultural background, your ethnicity, who your mama or your daddy was. Your ass now belongs to the Army, and we're going to make a soldier out of you, or we're going to remove you from this unit. And you go do something else. No problem. The world needs insurance salesmen and everybody else. But if you want to be a soldier, we're going to carve you into what it is to be a soldier. I don't understand why my colleagues can't see the difference between civilian life and military life. Nobody's firing live rounds at us up here. That's not part of our designated job description. But it damn sure is a job description for our soldiers. And we can't fill our ranks in the United States Army right now. You know why? I think you do know why. Because conservative families across America that have a deep lineage of military service are not encouraging their sons and daughters to join the Army because it is crap. that our sons and daughters are having to deal with now in the Army, that my colleagues are applauding, like, yay. You know, we need to diversify. They want to diversify it. It was called uniform for a reason. We must be uniformly deadly and effective, rapidly deployed. Well, we care not what the color of the skin is to the soldier next to us, or whether or not he's gay or straight. That has zero to do with the performance of our Army. And yet we are indeed attempting to indoctrinate those very civilian considerations into our military. That's why you can't fill the ranks, because traditional American families know that that's a wrong formula. Ranger Tebow. Rangers lead the way.
All the way, sir.
Oh, so I'm going to ask you, your opening line of your statement, you rightly draw upon a distinction regarding considering between those who join our military and those who choose just other courses of life. You said, I quote, training in the United States Army is meant to melt away the effects of civilian life and to forge Americans into soldiers ready to devote their lives to the mass application of violence on behalf of American interests. Can you speak to the uniqueness of what it is to be a soldier as opposed to being a civilian in America?
To be a soldier is to live a life where you take for granted the fact that you would die for the person next to you, and that you would enter an arena where that death is possible on purpose, and that you would be prepared as a team and as a person to do whatever it took, not to survive, but to win. And even if that requires immense suffering, sacrifice, and an inconvenience every day for you and your family.
Did you ever for one day, at any time, consider the diversity of the Ranger next to you?
No.
Thank you very much. Mr. Tebow, Mr. Lohmeyer, General, thank you all for your service. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Okay, Ms. Porter.
Was that my recognition? Okay, Ms. Porter. All right. Mr. Lohmeyer, do you agree with President Trump's executive order 9981?
Well,
Excuse me, President, I'm so sorry.
You'll
Let
have
me
to
start
explain
again.
what you mean. I don't know
Let me start again.
executive orders by number.
Do you agree with President Truman's order that integrated the armed services, despite the fact that separate but equal was still the law of the land at the time?
Let me say that this is an important point. The congressman to your left has said he wanted to find common ground. There's a lot of what the general has said today that I don't disagree with whatsoever, but that seems to me irrelevant to the discussion of progressivism as an ideology in the military workplace. Let me point out one example in answer to your question of what I am opposed to. Reintroduction of segregation.
Reclaiming my time,
which
Mr.
is
Lohmeyer.
a
Reclaiming my
direct
time.
consequence
Mr. Chair, it's my time.
of DEI initiatives. We've got
Mr. Chair, I'd like to
commanders who are
reclaim my
reintroducing
time.
segregation because of DEI, and I'm happy to talk to that.
Mr. Lohmeyer, I'm going to try again. Do you agree? I appreciate that you have opinions and you're entitled to have them, but I'd like you to try to answer the question I'm asking with respect, sir. Do you agree with President Truman's executive order 9981 that integrated the armed services despite the fact that separate but equal was still the law of the land at the time?
I agree that the military has led the way in integration and unity, which has been the strength of the United States military, but we're undoing it all with
thank you.
diversity, equity, and
Reclaiming my
policies.
time. That decision was progressive at the time. In other words, the military went to a place of integration and efforts to have Black and white soldiers working alongside each other. It wasn't always perfect. It wasn't always easy, but it was literally the definition of progress and progressive. It went beyond existing law. General, did Truman's actions to integrate the military under EO 9981 lead directly to any readiness deficits? You're a military historian.
No, in fact, the first thing it did, Congresswoman, was integrate Arlington National Cemetery.
Mr. LeBaer, you were in active duty, and thank you for your service, Air Force officer in 2010. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Were there any big problems in military readiness in 2010?
As a young flyer, I never paid attention to what you folks were doing. I never paid attention to reports on readiness, lethality. I simply focused on a mission. It was learning how to fly an aircraft. And at that time, it was training our allied partners and foreign military pilots how to fly jets.
Well, I'm glad, Mr. Lohmeyer, that you were able to focus on your military duties. And it seems to me that your own testimony here is a really good example of the fact that the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell did not cause a disruption in your ability or the military readiness of the Air Force to do its job. General, is there any empirical evidence that gay Americans serving openly has hurt military readiness?
No.
So historically, when the military has been progressive, has gone beyond where other policies may be, has tried to encourage diversity or welcome people to be diverse and to learn about each
really
other,
condescending.
there has been no harm to force readiness. General, could one consider President Truman's executive action a diversity initiative? Right, General Truman's. Why am I having so much trouble with this? General, could one consider President Truman's executive action a diversity initiative?
Yes.
How about the 2010 repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell?
Yes.
So in your view, should the military roll back those diversity policies?
Absolutely not.
Mr. Thibault, do you think the military should roll back those initiatives?
No, Congresswoman, I don't, because the integration of the armed forces in 1948 was a recognition that the military is different from society. And so it should march to the beat of a different drum. And that's why I think it was such a good policy, because it ensured that we had the best. That things changed in 1960 when the military became a beacon for affirmative action and quotas. But I agree with you that it was good policy in 1948.
Okay. And do you have, would you repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell?
No, because it's a means by which the military attracts the best talent. But what I would object to is if the military had a quota for LGBT Americans.
Do they?
On the books. Not that I know of, but they do for Black, white, Hispanic Americans. And I think those are.
General, is that correct? I'm not aware. My brother served. He went to the United States Naval Academy. He served 5 years. He served on a nuclear submarine. I don't recall him ever enforcing, being part of, as an officer, any type of quota system.
There are no quota systems, Congresswoman.
I don't recall that being U.S. military policy. I don't remember ever passing a law, since we're in Congress and we make the rules. I don't remember ever passing a law with regard to that. Our military is more effective when it's diverse, and you can't have an effective, diverse team without teaching people how to work effectively together. That's what these initiatives should focus on. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Gosar.
Thank you, Chairman Grothman, and thank you, gentlemen, for all your service. We appreciate it. The U.S. Armed Forces are under attack, not by a foreign adversary, but from within their own ranks. Woke policies have infiltrated the U.S. military and caused failing recruitment and retention rates, low morale, and quite frankly, pose a national security threat. Our service members are heroes and must endure considerable challenges in their sacrifice to our nation. Their focus should not be compromised by politically motivated critical race theory, LGBTQ training, and DEI and pro-abortion policies. Perhaps recruitment and retention efforts have failed, not because of the military's lack of diversity, but rather because service members are afraid of retaliation for speaking out against progressive policies. Just a few months ago, we heard from General Mark Milley, who said that service academies should teach about white rage, while simultaneously claiming the military is not woke. Lloyd Austin, in an unprecedented move in October of 2022, required the DoD to pay for the travel of service members seeking to end the life of their unborn children. Our servicemen and women deserve more from their leaders. Now, let me ask you both, Mr. Thibault and Mr. Lohmeyer, is war fair?
No.
Mr. Lohmeyer?
Can you repeat that? Did you say is war fair?
Fair.
No.
So in the comparison versus education versus war, that's not an equal application, is it?
No, Congressman.
Mr. Tebow?
They're different institutions, different experiences.
Very different.
Congressman.
So for your example, a improvised IED doesn't know the color of your skin, doesn't know if you're gay, whatever, right?
I don't know about the
right.
military itself, but the
Does the
military
enemy
academies
care what color you
do
are?
use affirmative
No,
action.
Congressman.
And here
That's
is
really
an
interesting.
article where
So
the Supreme Court allows it.
the DoD funds and relies on data from a group called START, the National Consortium of the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism. START came out with a figure in one of these reports that depicts a type of alleged extremist in the military. I think they're going to bring it up on the screen here, please. Shockingly, the vast majority are considered right-wing extremists. Categories of extremists include militia, which is specifically mentioned in the Constitution, including the Second Amendment, numerous times, male supremacists, and anti-abortion. My question for you, Mr. Tebow, do you think service members are leaving the military because they may be considered extremists for simply opposing abortion, owning a gun, or for a belief in a traditional family?
I don't think so, Congressman. The Inspector General report on extremism came out, I think, a few weeks ago on a Friday afternoon without much fanfare, where they said that there is no difference in the extremism in the military compared to society, and there was nothing to find. The American Principles Project surveyed veterans, hundreds of recently separated veterans, and the biggest reason why people left and also why they wouldn't join is because of a distrust of politicized military leadership, which I think speaks to the point and the value of this hearing.
Gotcha. So another question. If belief in a militia is extreme, the word is mentioned 5 times in the Constitution. And the Second Amendment says a well-regulated militia is necessary for the security of a free state. Does that mean the Constitution is an extreme document, according to this military-funded group?
Yeah, there seems to be a discrepancy or some cognitive dissonance there. But you know, I don't know how words are assigned to different meanings. But I think most service members are well-intentioned and good Americans, and both sides should do well to remember that.
Gotcha. Mr. Lohmeyer, thank you again for your service. Many of the talented men and women of the Air Force reside in my district at the Luke Air Force Base out in Arizona. So has the COVID jab mandate negatively affected the military's readiness?
There are a number of ways it seems it's impacted negatively our readiness. I'm not the expert on that issue, however. It's not what I wrote a book about. In fact, the mandates were rolling out at the time I separated from active duty, but I've got good friends and colleagues who would be perfect to testify about that issue.
So sadly, the DoD has refused to reinstate the thousands of service members kicked out of the military for rejecting the experimental COVID shot. Would reinstatement of these service members help improve the military's readiness?
Well, it's possible that it could, Congressman. The question is probably better stated whether or not any of those forced out for their decision or for the discrimination that led to their forcing out would even have any interest in coming back in. There are groups actively working at the moment to try and take action on behalf of those who either were injured or killed, their family members, or were forced out for their religious convictions or for violating their conscience to take what they consider to be an illegal, immoral, or an unethical order. And that has ripple effects today in the service. Again, I'm not the expert on that, but I'm friends with many who are, who'd be happy to testify about it.
Well, I want to say thank you very much, all three of you, for your service. We appreciate it. You're heroes in my book and in our district. So thank you very much. I yield back.
Thanks, Mr. Raskin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I also want to thank all of our witnesses for their excellent testimony today and also for their service to the country, and also members of this committee who served in the uniform as well as in this body. Mr. Seidel, am I do I have the right? Or General Seidel, I want to look at 3 attacks on politicization or diversity changes, and the thing that I guess people are calling woke. I want to start with women in the military, and of course, women were systematically excluded from the military for a long time, and there's a huge struggle about that. And finally, women were able to enter the armed forces on relatively equal status. I don't know if my friend Mr. Higgins would consider these part of the traditional American soldiers or not. But women have served for a long time in different capacities and now have equality. But if I'm assuming that women in the military want the same rights that women across the country do, and after Donald Trump's gerrymandered Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade and women's right to choose, which was in the law for more than a half century, women across the country have rejected that and have stood up for their full reproductive freedom, including in Kansas, Wisconsin, Michigan, California, Vermont, you name it. Everywhere it's been on the ballot, the vast majorities of women and men have supported women's right to choose. So I assume, now I don't have a study on it, but I assume women in the military feel the same way. That they would want to maintain their right to choose their own reproductive health care. Now, Senator Tuberville interfered with hundreds and hundreds of military promotions for many, many months in order to stop women in the military from having their complete full access to reproductive choice and to health care. Now, who do you think is politicizing the military? Is it Senator Tuberville with his anti-choice agenda, where he wants to dictate to all of the women of the military what their access will be to healthcare? Or is it those women themselves? Are they the ones that are somehow perpetrating a woke agenda by saying that they want to have equal choice? And don't we depend on women in the military these days? Last I saw, it was something like 18 or 20%, even in the Army. So please answer that if you would.
Yes, I would say that Senator Tuberville created political pawns out of those general officers. We have a non-political army, and we're one of the few countries in the history of the world that has never had a military coup d'etat. And it's partly because we are non-political. And yet, Senator Tuberville created political pawns for a policy he disagreed with. I couldn't disagree more with him for doing that and hurting our force and those general and flag officers.
The military also depends on lots of African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans. That's just a reality. You might love it, you might hate it, you might be ambivalent about it, you might just accept it. But in any event, that's the reality, as I understand it. And in any event, the Army decided that it wanted to rename military bases that had been named not after U.S. generals, but after Confederate generals who joined the Confederacy in rebellion against the Union. So like Fort Benning was renamed after a pro-Union, pro-American general. Fort Gordon was renamed as Fort Eisenhower. Fort Hill was renamed as Fort Walker. And yet, I take it this is part of the big anti-woke arraignment and indictment of the military, that we have renamed military bases after pro-Union, pro-American soldiers, generals, people who've been loyal and faithful to the Union, as opposed to those who have opposed the Union and took up arms against the Union in traitorous insurrection. Now, who's politicizing this question? Is it the people who go along with the Army's decision to say that's who our bases should be named after, pro-Americans, or the people who are wanting to stick to the old Confederate battle names? And I'd like you to address that. And also, Mr. Lohmeyer, I think you've taken the position against changing the names. Yeah.
Well, remember that the names were changed, Congressman, because this body voted overwhelmingly, overrode the veto of President Trump to create the naming commission, of which I served as vice chair. It was my proudest moment to rename those after true American heroes and not those who chose treason to preserve slavery.
Thank you. And do you agree with that, Mr. Lohmeyer?
I'll say that it's my view that Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin has politicized the military. As soon as the Supreme Court decision was made, he issued a policy memorandum blaming the Supreme Court's decision to reverse Roe v. Wade on the recruitment.
Wait, but I'm asking about the naming.
I'm asking
about the naming of our military bases. If you don't want to address it, say you don't want to answer it.
Yeah,
but I understand
I walked Black Lives Matter Plaza yesterday with a Chinese American.
Yeah, I didn't ask you about that.
No, I'm answering your question. Excuse me.
Yeah.
And she advocated.
Is it okay, Mr. Chairman, if we go over here, because
for leaving the
witness wants to
no, I'd like to answer more than yes or no
We
questions.
can let him answer the question.
Yeah, I can let him answer, because I wasn't quite done yet, but now he's occupying my time. If you want him to answer it, that's fine. So
Go
yes,
ahead.
about the renaming of the bases after pro-union,
Sure.
pro-American
Thank
generals.
you, Mr. Raskin. I'd like
Yeah.
to answer that question in more than just a yes or no format.
Okay.
I walked the Black Lives Matter Plaza yesterday with Xi Van Fleet, Chinese Maoist
Wow.
Cultural Revolution
Put Mr.
survivor, and I
Raskin
had
in his
an
place.
interesting
Good for him.
conversation with her in which she advocated. I'd never thought about this before. By the way, I don't address this topic in my book. I wrote about Marxist critical race theory. She said, I'd recommend that once we defeat wokeism, we leave all of the Black Lives Matter paint on the ground and the signs naming the streets. I asked her why. She says, because it's a reminder that once here on the north side of the White House, we had a woke revolution, a Marxist revolution take place. And I agree with that. It's a reminder that there has been such divisive conflict in this enemy before that people were willing to use violent force to hurt one another. I have no problem with the general's efforts.
If I understand
pursue-
you correctly, I'm trying to
Here,
torture out an
we'll
answer,
just
but
let him-
what you're saying is that we should have
What-
army bases named after Confederate generals or Nazi generals, people we've
wait.
defeated
No,
in war.
I'm
Is
not.
that right?
I'm not willing
Just a
to
minute.
let you put words in my mouth. I'm
We're
happy to
we're
do
about
just
that.
answer
2
the
minutes
point.
over here, so
That's
we're
fine.
just going to let Mr. Lohmeyer finish, and that's it.
So my point is, this is not an issue in which I've actively been involved.
Mm.
The renaming of base. I wrote a book about Marxist DEI, Marxist critical race theory. That's my expertise. I have no personal issue with the fact that this gentleman to my left, who honorably served his country, has been a part of a commission to do that. I have personal opinions about why it's wrong-headed and a part of an ideological push, but this is not my
So
issue.
you would
That's
not have
my
renamed
topic.
them, in other words.
Well, we're
Point of
we're
order.
2.5
That's
minutes
not
over.
something I ever focused
All right, I think I
on.
got my answer,
not
Mr.
something I've
Chairman.
ever
I'll yield
focused
back
Go
to
for
you.
Mr. Biggs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the witnesses being here today. So, Mr. Lohmeyer, when we look at some of the things that have been said by the gentleman to your left, and I don't think I can pronounce your name. I want to pronounce it right.
Sigilly, but
Mr. Sigilly, yes,
Yeah.
thank you. And I've read your testimony. I'm interested to know your reaction to his positions with regard to the diversification of the military
Sure.
and DEI. in
Thank you.
particular.
One point that the general made with which I disagree is that diversity is our strength. I don't think there's any evidence for that, but definitions matter. Words matter, and we're losing touch with this. I would reject the notion that diversity is our strength based on DEI definitions of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Merit-based, okay, I'm going to get away from that because if we're trying to find a unity of understanding, let me say this: skill and performance matter in the military if you'd like to deter conflict and win our nation's wars, period. As a commander in the military, I had a black colonel fly across the country to promote me to lieutenant colonel because I love the hell out of the guy and respect his views on the Federalist Papers, which he was teaching me after work hours, and because he was the best leader I've ever worked with. The best airman that I had working for me, incidentally, was a transgender airman. So don't bullshit me and say that you think you know what you're talking about. You've never served. You don't understand how this works. We care about performance in the military, period. You don't know what you're talking about. Most of the people in this room don't know what they're talking about. We need lethality in the military, period. All of the stuff you guys talk about, the men and women in uniform don't think about. They go play Call of Duty at night after they learn their mission and execute that mission, period. They don't know what you're talking about. They don't know what you're voting on. They don't care about your sexual preference. They don't care what you look like, and they don't care what the person next to them looks like, period. I'm a citizen of this country, and I can dislike you and criticize you all I want here, but our men and women in uniform cannot. And so I speak on their behalf when I say lethality matters, merit-based selection and promotions matter, and your ideology doesn't matter one bit. And we need to identify principles which will preserve our union and preserve the unity of the United States military. If we do not, we'll lose that union. And it's my contest. Whatever Truman did decades ago, you ask your average military service member when Truman was the president of the United States, they can't even tell you. But my point is, they're focused on what's happened since the George Floyd riots. There are things that have happened in the last 3 years in our military that we're up here to testify about, not not the things that happened 60 years ago. We're great today because of what we've done for the last half century in the fighting of the Cold War.
And Mr. Lohmeyer, what has happened in the last 3 years that has caused lethality to deteriorate in the military?
There's been an overt politicization of the military workplace and the forcing of trainings that are anti-American, that criticize our founders, that allege that white supremacy is a problem within the military ranks, which has never been proven. And all of that rhetoric that occurred once Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin took office led to a bunch of moaning and bitching and complaining behind closed doors of our service members. And I heard it as a commander. And so I wrote a formal written IG complaint about it that was dismissed by senior leaders because they were afraid of the political and racial climate that we've created in this country. And so they were afraid to hold one another accountable for their politics. Senior leaders. So they're not held accountable for their political worldview, but young people will be held accountable. I'm living evidence and a living example of the fact that the diversity initiatives are discriminatory. I was kicked out for saying I'd like to depoliticize the workplace, not for advocating for Republicanism, or excuse me, small r, Republican, not for advocating for Republican candidates, not for criticizing Democrat candidates. I never publicly advocated for anyone politically, but I was forced out because of viewpoint discrimination. Diversity initiatives are discriminatory, and inclusion initiatives are exclusive of my viewpoint.
So,
and so I'm living evidence that the politicization of the military workplace in the past several years is discriminatory, and it discriminates specifically against conservatism and Christianity, period.
Mr. Chairman, I want to submit for the record something called Declaration of Military Accountability, an open letter to the American people from signatories of the Declaration of Military Accountability into the record.
So entered.
And then I apologize. I actually had questions for Mr. Tebow and Mr. Sessley as well, but we've run out of time, and I don't think I'm going to get that additional 2.5 minutes that the ranking member got. So I'll yield back.
Mr. Lynch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Sedguli, first of all, thank you all for your service to our country. Really do appreciate it. I've been a member of this committee for about 22 years. And while I have not served in the military, I've led most of them, but done about 20 trips to Afghanistan, over 20 trips to Iraq to try to understand, because I have not served. But I thought if I spent enough time on the ground that I might learn. I might understand what it is our servicemen and women are dealing with. One of my last trips to Afghanistan before the withdrawal, visited a place called Camp Leatherneck, and had a chance to participate in a citizenship ceremony. And what they did was they have a couple of programs. One is MIVNA. There's a couple of programs where non-citizens of the United States can serve in the military, and it improves their chances. It doesn't guarantee, but it improves their chances of becoming citizens. It's somewhat of a progressive idea, I think, because here you are taking, at that particular ceremony, there were over 100 men and women of all colors and faiths, I'm sure. But they all took the oath. They all had the American flag on their shoulder. They had been chasing the Taliban up and down that province, in combat. So, it just struck me, when you think about that, the quote, Jack Kennedy's quote, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. It seemed like this group, anyway, this group of young men and women in uniform, they wanted to be U.S. citizens for all the right reasons, And I actually think that, having spent time with a couple of those rifle platoons, that sort of that experience, and some of them, they were in mixed units. So, it wasn't just all one group, but a lot of, native born American citizen soldiers serving right beside them. There seemed to be high levels of camaraderie, in a really dangerous environment. So they were pretty tight as far as I could see. And General Sedguli, even though that's somewhat of a progressive idea, is that something that you think promotes strength in the military, or is that a progressive idea that you think might deteriorate in the long term, because they were non-citizens up to that point?
Immigrants in our military have been one of our great strengths, one of our great superpowers. We spoke over 100 languages in World War I. We have had immigrants fight in every war we've ever had, and it's one of the things that we do better than any other army or military in the world. I hope that we can get more of them in because they serve their nation greatly and become great Americans.
Mr. Loheimer?
Thank you. On its face, I don't disagree with that. It doesn't necessarily mean that they'll perform in any given job they're put in. That's true for any American, and
Fair
it's
enough.
true of anyone that joins in
Yeah.
uniform.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mr. Tebow?
Mr. Lynch, I wholeheartedly accept these brave Americans who have served, coming into the military as immigrants. I would make a distinction between some policies that are suggested to bring illegal immigrants into service, but they are good they're good members of the military because they're good members of the military, not because of the color of their skin or because they're immigrants.
Right. I should have added, there is a requirement. I had talked to the officers in charge. There is a requirement that they have sort of a clean bill of health, that they can't, they can't join the military to escape, justice or anything like that. So, but that's all I got, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back. Thank you.
Thank you much. Mr. Sessions?
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. This hearing today is being conducted by the National Security, the Border and Foreign Affairs to examine how progressive ideologies affect military readiness. There was no conclusion that was drawn. We're asking you. And I want to thank each of you for your service to our country. I find all three of you exceptionally well, not only prepared and well read, but able to defend your positions. I, as a boy, am an Eagle Scout and have stayed very active in scouting. And we have a saying that says something like, leave your campsite better than the way you found it. Each of you have served in the military, and I'm a conservative Republican from Texas. You could figure that out by my voice. But we are concerned about the things that we have heard today, including lethality, the number of people who come and go in the military, the reason why this administration has taken the position it has, up to and including one of my nephews who is an Army Ranger, who was not willing to accept the COVID shot because of his age and the medical feedback. Can you please tell me, are we leaving our campsite better than the way we found it? Any of you?
Mr. Sessions, what we know in the last 2 years is that every branch of the military except the Marine Corps has missed their recruiting goals by a lot for the first time in the all-volunteer force since Vietnam. There's more and more evidence that it's due to the inseep of a political crisis, a politicization of the military, and the confidence that that gives every American to join a military that is dedicated to American interests and not partisan objectives. And I think that's an indication that things are, in fact, getting worse. And maybe we still are the best military in the world, but let's not wait until we're not to change things.
Well, that's right. That's that leave your campsite better than you found it, sir. Commander?
Yeah, Congressman,
General?
I'm so proud to serve for 36 years in the Army. I wouldn't have stayed if it hadn't been that way. I have served with armies throughout the world, and it is not even close how much better equipped, better led, better manned, with better political leadership we are than any other army in the world. So I would tell you that over my career, that the Army is in better shape now than it's ever been. And it's because of the people that serve and the leaders that are there.
Yes, sir, but that's not the question. The question is, are we leaving our campsite better for the future? If we're not meeting our goals of retention, of having people stay in. If we're having to pay extravagant amounts of money for people to talk them into staying, the question was not about your service. The question is your knowledge of the service. Are we leaving our campsite better than what we found?
And Congressman, I would say that in 2022, the Army recruited 45,000. In 2023, it was 55,000. We still have people in the pipeline coming in. So the task force of Army recruiting did a great job of fixing many of those problems, and it looks like it's on the upswing rather than the downswing.
Okay, thank you. I did ask for your professional expertise, and you gave me a solid answer. Commander?
Thank you, Congressman. I recently read that pilot bonuses in our Air Force are up to $600,000.
Me too.
And that's more than double what it was when I was flying F-15s 10 years ago. And a question I have is, and I talked to pilots about this, is why is it that they would choose, despite such an increase in the incentive bonus, to leave, go fly with the airlines, separate, either go into retirement or separate early without their retirement? And I've heard responses like, well, we heard the Air Force spokesperson say we'd like to reduce the number of white pilots from 85% to 67.5%. So my question is that not a quota?
It would be. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to add to the record here. Air Force goes on diversity, equity, inclusion, hiring spree. Top pays up to $183,500. I'd like to enter that into the record. I appreciate all three of you for your service. May God be with you, and thank you for keeping us one nation under God. I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Mace.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses this morning for your service to our country and for being here and spending some time with us today. Every time a colleague of mine on the other side of the aisle doesn't want to have an ideological discussion or discussion of real policy that makes real differences in the lives of the men and women in our country, whether they're serving our nation or otherwise, they just invoke the word Trump. It's just Trump, Trump, Trump. That's all they can talk about. And quite frankly, I find it tiring and nauseating, because we have a real opportunity here to make a difference in the lives of every American, and especially for those that are literally putting their lives on the line to serve our country. And, I'm one of the only Republicans up here on the Hill who has talked about Roe v. Wade, who has talked about finding common ground, who has talked about moderating on abortion and finding out where both sides can find agreement. And there's so much where we can find agreement on, but I have yet to find one Democrat who's willing to work with me on the issue of abortion and finding common ground. And the minute you ask them what their limits are on abortion, they won't answer the question. They flee the room, they get the heck out of the way because they don't want to answer the question, because the left often has absolutely no limits on abortion. That's a travesty here today too. And shouldn't really be the point of the conversation, because unfortunately, the policies of this administration, the results speak for themselves. Recruiting is down, retention is down, morale is down, while demonizing the military and our veterans is up. And I remember when I was graduating from the Citadel a long time ago, 25 years ago, my own father's concerns about the military. We didn't have the word woke back then, but he saw what was changing. He spent 28 years in the United States Army. He is the most decorated living graduate the Citadel has ever seen in its history. And I remember the conversations we would have and how much the military had changed. And in 25 years, it's way off base now with some of the policies we're seeing, particularly with this administration. And so, the United States military has long been held to the American public as the most respected and trusted institutions of our country, and rightfully so. It's revered. The standing exists because they've remained above the fray of partisan politics. But politics has now gotten into our military, and we've seen the demonization of our active duty military and our veterans. And so I find this conversation deeply disappointing because, as was mentioned earlier, I believe by Mr. Lohmeyer, about lethality and why qualifications actually matter. Because when you're in the trenches, when you're in war, it doesn't matter what you look like. So my first question is going to go to Mr. Lohmeyer. Talking about lethality, you've been in the trenches, you've been in war, you've been in combat theater. Does the color of your skin matter when you're in the trenches, when you're in combat?
The answer is no, it doesn't matter. And we've sometimes joked in veteran circles that the last thing that our active duty troops currently wearing the uniform say when they're getting deployed downrange to the desert or to Eastern Europe is, geez, I wish I had another diversity, equity, and inclusion training before hitting the road.
Does gender matter when you're in war, when you're in combat, when you're in battle?
No, I'd say no again, but it also depends on strength and depends on your profession. And I have no problem saying that. That's why we have standards in place.
Does sexual orientation matter if you're
I'd
wearing a
say
uniform?
no, it does not incidentally matter, but if it becomes a matter of activist political orientation, then it could influence the military workplace.
I don't think anyone believes having people from diverse backgrounds in the military is a bad thing. I haven't heard any of that today. I think everybody in the country would welcome diversity no matter what industry they're in. Can you explain specifically how what we're seeing in terms of DEI programs today that goes far beyond that? Mr. Lohmeyer.
You mentioned the issue that Trump's name is invoked as a talking point, an easy go-to talking
To not
point.
talk about the issues
Right.
of policy.
And I'll use that to answer your question, Congresswoman. You know, I had a base commander who, in the lead up to an election, threatened forfeiture of pay for all of the members of his base if he caught a whiff of Trump's support in the lead up to the election. In my view, that's court-martialable. It's illegal. It's a violation of the Hatch Act. And it was a direct, express outcome of his ideological worldview. He was a friendly guy. He was loved and respected by a lot of people, but he created a climate of fear. And his top issues were, and by the way, Heritage Foundation and Congressman Waltz just recently did a report of the National Independent Panel of Military Service and Readiness. And I've got feedback right here from people in the uniform. Active military members' trust in the military is declining for the overt politicization of the military workplace, transgender policies, withdrawal from Afghanistan debacle, reduction in physical fitness standards to even the playing field for diversity's sake. So all of the things that we've heard today aren't necessarily the issues of progressivism that are hurting the military. They're in fact what our military members are saying are the issues for which they're losing their trust in their senior leaders. So when they hear a Mark Milley say, well, I want to learn about white rage, you at least get half of the force shutting off and losing trust in their military leadership. Now, he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs when he said it. When the Secretary of Defense says things, there issues a policy memorandum saying that it was a Supreme Court decision that's hurting our recruiting and readiness, when they themselves have been speaking up for 2 years saying, no, 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 that's not the reason we don't want to stay in the service. Then there's a divide that takes place. And it's that divide that I think we've been invited here to talk about. And so that's my answer to that question. I think that's at the heart of the matter, is that ideology divides. It's always divided. And none of the panel members up here seem to have any issue with the idea of naturally occurring diversity, which has been a beautiful and lovely part both of nature and of the blessing of the United States of America. We are naturally a diverse group of people, and it's because we have the freedom to think and speak clearly and share those views. And ideology also shuts that down too. And it's an enforced equality of thought, of expression. It's discriminatory.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Since stepping into the Oval Office, President Biden and his administration have pushed their political agenda on our men and women in uniform. This is completely unacceptable. When top defense officials allow politically driven priorities to affect military readiness, the DoD is failing at its job and making us vulnerable on a global stage. Our service members sacrifice so much to protect and defend our country. They deserve better than to be treated as a social engineering experiment by the left. Over the past couple of years, concepts of diversity, equity, and inclusion have pervaded our country's institutions, even causing presidents of what were previously this country's most esteemed universities to believe that they have the political cover to defend calls for genocide. Curriculum centered on critical race theory and DEI concepts teaches students more about their differences than their similarities and shared values, which runs counter to the core ethos of our armed forces. The Department of Defense's mission statement and #1 objective must always be to provide combat credible military forces needed to deter war and protect the nation's security. The most pressing problem today for force readiness is the ongoing struggle with recruitment, and pushing partisan politics on our armed forces is one way to ensure we continue moving the wrong direction on this issue. We must ensure that our military leadership is more focused on the threat from our greatest adversaries than enforcing a politically correct, divisive ideology that is counterproductive to maintaining a cohesive military unit. I look forward to working with my colleagues on this committee to hold the administration accountable, particularly on issues that jeopardize our national security. Mr. Tebow, in 2021, a professor of political science at the U.S. Air Force Academy published an op-ed in the Washington Post defending the teaching of critical race theory and arguing that it is productive for members of the military to understand a fuller, let's quote, understand a fuller version of American history. Why do you disagree with that sentiment, or what would you say in response to it?
I don't know the specific case, Congressman, but my issue is when training in the military focuses on what someone believes or who they might be because of their assumed background based on the color of their skin, that engenders really complicated and divisive assumptions in a unit that needs to survive based on cohesion. And so if I receive a training that says, oh, you're a white man, and which means you have blind spots on race or sex, that means a soldier or an airman joins a unit with the presumption of distrust already built into their DNA. But I would say, you know, it should not be surprising that the Air Force Academy is teaching that when they decide their admissions classes based on race-based percentiles. It's not called a quota, but in effect, those are quotas that are as harmful as any training the Air Force promotes.
Thank you. Mr. Lohmeyer, along with your testimony, you submitted dozens upon dozens of quotes from men and women who had retired from the military. Those quotes are critical of the current woke culture of the military, and many former military service members cite DEI efforts and wokeism in the military as part of their motivation to get out. Why do you believe that DEI policies have been a cause for reduced recruitment over the past couple of years?
Yeah, the quotes that I submitted in Exhibit 1, for the record, there were approximately 1,000 unsolicited quotations of feedback from our service members that are in that document. And the professor at the Air Force Academy that you're referring to is Lynn Chandler Garcia, who essentially bragged about teaching critical race theory. And this is my area of expertise. And the reason it's so divisive is because it was literally, this is not just figure of speech, literally created by Marxist ideologues with the specific purpose of dividing people into groups for the purpose of fomenting cultural revolution, period. Period, full stop. I'll back that up 100% all day. I studied it for years. I studied at DoD strategy schools. I studied Marxist cultural revolutions around the world, and it looks and smells the same everywhere you go. And so it wasn't surprising to me to see the same base commander who was threatening forfeiture of pay if he caught a whiff of Trump support, that he said, no one will stand in the way of the Black Lives Matter movement at my base. What's interesting and sad about it is that it was okay to show a support ideologically for the movement, but not to criticize the same movement without being accused of political partisanship. And this is how this goes. It's politically partisan if you disagree with the party line. It is not politically partisan if you toe the party line. That's why it's divisive.
Thank you for your answer, and I want to thank all three of you for being here and
Absolutely.
for your service. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Fallon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for all the witnesses for taking your time. A veteran myself, and I apologize, Air Force, for 4 years. I found it interesting because when you live something directly, that was 30 years ago. And dare I say now that we're in 2024, Mr. Chairman, almost 35 years ago. And one of the first things they did when we in process, as I was a young second lieutenant, 22 years old, was they told us about how the military works, and there's zero tolerance for isms. There will not be sexism in the military. There will not be racism in the military. Now, of course, when you have an organization of, at the time, almost 2 million, you're going to have your outliers. But it was the extreme exception and absolutely not the rule. And they told us that if you participate in any of these things, you will be separated from the military because you are not someone that can function in a cohesive unit.
in the branch of the service. And I absolutely loved that, because contrary to so many people that foment division in this chamber, that's how my parents raised us. That's the majesty of living in the 20th and now 21st century in America. It is racism is a diminishing phenomena every day. Does it exist? Of course, but it's diminishing every day. So I found it interesting when I got this job in January 21 that there was a focus in the new administration on white extremism, political extremism, particularly white supremacy, that kind of movement in the military. So I have Mr. Is it Sigilly?
Yes, sir. You're great.
Okay,
Thank you.
great name and challenging one. So
It's
thank you.
challenging for everyone.
It's a little scary. Do you believe that white extremism is an issue and a problem, let's say a pervasive problem in the military today?
It's been several years since I've been out. I really don't know, Congressman.
Okay. Well, this administration clearly did, because they had a stand down where the entire military, obviously in stages, stood down to get, I think it was 4 hours of training on the dangers of white extremism. And I found that interesting, because then I like to live with data in the real world. So I asked the different branches of the service, the commanding officers, the 4-star generals, how many people in that last fiscal year were separated due to white extremist activity. And in the United States Army, with at the time 1.1 million active reserve and National Guardsmen, 1.1 million, that number was 9. So not quite 1 in a million, but damn near close. In the United States Marine Corps, reservists and active duty, I think it was 222,000 at the time. That number was 4 out of almost 250,000. And the Navy and Air Force were begrudgingly finally came forward and said, yes, our numbers would be commensurate with those numbers, so single digits. And then when you factor in the man hours lost when you stand down for 4 hours and talk about an issue that's not a pervasive issue, you're talking hundreds of millions of dollars to satisfy a political objective with the United States military. And then, we talk about diversity is our strength and this and that. I think merit's our strength. And I think, as obviously an unabashed conservative, that success, talent, ability, skill comes in all shapes, sizes, and shades. That's what I have seen in my experience. There are geniuses, and their pigmentation is completely immaterial to what's on their mind and their education and their drive and their talent and ability. So merit should be first, because I think that we would agree, we have a great panel here. Colonel Lohmeyer, would you agree that the
Yes,
Chinese
merit
military
should
is
be
a grave
first.
threat to not only this country, but really freedom and liberty in the world?
Yes, I agree with that, both as a foreign adversary and also as an information facilitator domestically here in this country.
And Mr. Thibodeau?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Sigilly?
Yes.
Okay, so we're all in agreement. I think most members of Congress would agree. There's 435 in this chamber. Probably get to 433. There's always a couple outliers, as we know. But what I find interesting about that is the Chinese military diverse ethnically? No, because diversity has nothing to do with military strength. It's about merit. And I think that in this country, we are the most diverse major country in the world. And I think that's wonderful and beautiful. And, but we need to focus more on merit and the best, because we hear this so much here, these standards of, well, we need diversity, equity, inclusion, and things of that nature, which again, merit, that will all sort itself out. Because if anybody in this room needed life-saving brain surgery tomorrow, you know what your criteria would be? The best. You wouldn't give a rat's ass what nationality this person was, what ethnicity, what gender, what religion, what God they worship, none of it. Who's the best surgeon in the world to preserve my life so I can live it for my family, my kids, and my country? I want to thank the witnesses again. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this great topic, and I yield back.
Thank you. Good point. Mr. Walls?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Siegel?
Whatever you want, Congressman. I'm
What is it?
good. Thank you.
Sigilly.
Sigilly.
All right, start with you. I think you would well know that I was just reviewing Joint Pub 3.0, Joint Operations, a foundation of joint operations in the military, and nowhere in there does it call for diversity of command. It does call for unity of command, and it talks a lot about unit morale and the need for unity within our military units. You testified earlier that you haven't seen Marxism, critical race theory. You don't know where it is in the military or where it is at West Point. Is that accurate characterization?
I had not heard of it when I was at West Point, teaching there for 2 decades. I had not heard of it until it became a national issue.
When did you leave West Point?
I stopped teaching there in 2019.
Okay. So you're unaware then that critical race theory 101 is part of the West Point curriculum?
Critical,
According to, and I'd like to enter into the record,
I'm not
a
quite
letter.
sure what, that you're saying that there's a department of critical race
No,
theory?
there is it's part of the syllabus, excuse me,
The part of the syllabus for what, Congressman?
for one of the classes at West Point.
Well, no, I think that that's absolutely true, that for one class, for one elective, it certainly could be.
Do you agree with the lecture, Understanding Your Whiteness and White Rage, taught by Dr. Carol Anderson of Emory University, that should be taught at West Point?
I'm not familiar with that lecture.
Do-
The thing
Essentially,
is
the theme is that white people are enraged. Not 100 years ago, not 40 years ago, which you're talking about, the 60s and 70s. Today, white cadets, white people are enraged by black advancement.
well, I think, Congressman, the great thing about education is that you can get a variety of different perspectives.
Sure.
It's not training, which is what some of my colleagues have talked about. I'm talking about education. You want to hear the broadest representation of every viewpoint.
Do you
so that
understand?
You can hear that.
I know this is the very clever approach of the left to conflate history with current day training. So would you agree that critical race theory is a foundation for DEI?
No, I would not. I don't know that to be true. DEI, it goes back to equal opportunity in the early part of the 1970s. It's still just a part of what equal opportunity. I would say
What's the difference in equity and equality? Equal opportunity, which is, so right now, the Director of National Intelligence, how infused this ideology has become across our national security apparatus, the Director of National Intelligence has an Office for Equal Opportunity, which, for the record, I fully agree with. I want every American, race, religion, socioeconomic background, to have an equal opportunity to serve. They also have an Office of DEI, including equity. What's the difference in equity?
Well, I
and
would say
equality?
that when this started as a historian, it started as a Defense Race Relation Institute and then became the Defense Equal
What's the
Opportunity.
difference in equity and equality? Equal opportunity to serve and equity, which is an equal outcome for all.
I would again say that the equal opportunity, which at least at West Point, when I was there and started the
I'm all
DEI
for equal
program,
opportunity.
but the equal opportunity program falls
What's
under the
equity?
DEI at West Point.
What's equity?
I don't know what, Congressman, if
You're here as an expert today, the Democratic witness. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is part of there's a DEI office in the Pentagon, a chief
there's
DEI
there's
officer.
DEI in many
And
of
you
those.
don't know what equity, you can't testify to what equity means. Well, I'll tell you, since you don't know.
Thank you, Congressman.
It is equal outcomes for all, which is a hallmark of Marxism. DEI is Marxist-based, as is critical race theory, but let's progress, since, I mean, apparently the expert doesn't know what equity is in DEI. I have here, I'd like to enter for the record, a class composition with racial goals for West Point. You just testified, you were under oath, you were in the admissions office.
I was there. I wasn't in the admissions office. I was on the admissions committee for 1 year. And I know that there were no quotas, is what I said, Congressman.
So we're going to parse over quotas and goals. This is from the superintendent.
We know that's not true.
And here's the goals. And it has African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, women with percentages. We have red here for when they missed those goals. That's,
As I said, Congressman,
That's
there
an
are
issue.
no quotas on the, when I was
Okay.
on the admissions committee, there were no
Let's
quotas.
also
There is
enter into
also,
the record-
Congressman, the ability to have athletes on there. So there are many other goals on there, as I'm sure you've seen,
Mm-hmm.
on what are the other. And if you could go read all of those goals, it would tell you how deep that is. And in fact,
Here's
one of
the
the
problem.
largest number of people that are recruited at West Point are athletes, 25%.
Here's the problem. When you have in any elite institution, when you say, and your directive is to advance one group based on the skin color, you have to take those slots from another group based on their skin color.
And
It's
Congressman,
a zero sum.
but the largest of those groups is the athletes.
It's a zero sum. Oh, well, the athletes get broken down by their skin color.
And
In this chart.
25%
In this chart that
of
you
those.
just said doesn't exist, but let's continue. This is my time. Here, just to go how system-wide, Mr. Chairman, here's a memorandum from the Secretary of the Air Force with white, black, Asian, American Indian. I mean, I think my wife, who's an Army veteran, who is Arab, she didn't have a place, I guess, in this chart. My son, who's now multiracial, I don't know if he would have probably looks white to most people. I don't know that he would have a place. But here you have current percentages and a mandate to increase those percentages. You have to then take those slots, whether they're pilot slots or whatever, from someone else based on ethnicity. This is signed by the now chairman of the Joint Chiefs, C.Q. Brown, signed by the Secretary of the Air Force with the mandate, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry, excuse me. With a mandate, you are directed to develop. Mr. Chairman, would you mind yielding?
I'll yield him all of my time. I'll yield him all of
Mr.
my time.
Chairman, if it's
Okay,
okay, if I could have
that's okay.
another.
Well,
I just want to get this on the record because I think we've had some very misleading testimony today. With the mandate, you are directed to develop a DEI plan within 30 days and report back annually based on percentages. This is illegal, it's wrong, and it's a divisive. Finally, I just want to ask as a matter, here are some of the key proponents of CRT, which basically says to be less white is to be less racially oppressive. To be white, no member of society is innocent. What these authors say is that if you're white, you are incapable of not being racist.
How is that
in and of
statement
itself
alone not
is
racist?
sir. And by the way, these were lecturers at the Air Force Academy. That is divisive, and it's wrong, and it's destructive. And finally, Mr. Chairman, thank you for your indulgence. We have data that shows, as Mr. Lohmeyer has testified to, 62% of active duty military members are seeing a politicized military. 65% will recommend their child not join, and now we're in a recruiting crisis. This is why these hearings are so necessary. And you are right, Mr. Siegel, in that Congress drives change. This Congress has banned critical race theory in the military in this defense bill. We have eliminated the hiring of divisive DEI bureaucrats. We are going to drive this change to get our military back to a meritocracy with equal opportunity for all. You cannot fight racism with more racism, and you have to have data.
Yes.
Final question, Mr. Chairman. Do you, General Siegel, have any data that shows that a more or less diverse submarine bomber brigade is more lethal or less lethal? Let's go with a submarine crew.
Congressman, I know that a submarine's lethality comes with its nuclear weapons. We have the most lethal.
No, I'm talking about the crew. You have to have people to operate it.
Right. And I would go back to my area of expertise, which is in the early 1970s, when we did not have that lethality then. And,
But
and
today-
the reason that we didn't have that lethality then is because we did not have policies that allowed us to have that.
We're now 50 years beyond that.
And the reason
Do
that
you
we're
have
so
any
good
data
is we've
that
had those
shows-
policies. Those policies have
Do you
made
have
us as
any data
successful
that
as we
shows
are right now.
by percentage, a more or less, let's say bomber crew, let's say brigade, whether it's 50% black, 10% black, 30% Jewish, any of these societal factors, data that drives readiness?
I would say that the only way we can have an equal force that is ready and able is to recruit that force. And if we can't recruit that force from the entire country and have leadership that reflects that, then we are not going to be a successful military. But we are a successful military in part because some of these policies allow us to recruit and retain the greatest Americans
I'll take
in the
that for the
country.
record that there is no actual data. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you much. I guess we have a couple minutes for Mr. Comer left.
I have 2 more minutes if you want to go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Take it, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead. You're the
Got it.
expert. Go ahead.
Let's go with, just for the record, with General Burt here and how politicization is infusing our military. This is General Burt from your service. Mr. Lohmeyer, and I'd like you to comment on this, who stated publicly at a forum that she is compelled to consider different candidates who are perhaps less qualified if they disagree with state law. Can you talk about the implications of civilian oversight of the military if we have a 3-star general, active duty, in front of a large crowd, live streamed, talking about sending less qualified people to certain states because of their state laws? And should the military now be able to opine? For example, this is the Pandora's box that is being opened, that if maybe I don't like the Second Amendment laws or the gun restriction laws in a certain location, that I should now be able to self-select with the military to go to a different place?
Thank you, Congressman. One of the points that General Sigilly made earlier was that he was unaware of the many hundreds of senior military leaders ever saying anything aught of Senator Tuberville's hold on confirmations. And I suppose, generally speaking, that's fair enough. But during that same time period is when General Deanna Burt made the comments you're referring to, and it was overtly political. And I'll tell you from my own experience while in the Space Force is that the entire time I was there, this is one of the respected leaders in the Space Force to whom people looked, trusted as a warfighter because she was talented as a warfighter. But the moment you make a statement like that, you lose trust, confidence of the vast majority of people under your command.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thanks much. Mr. Comer's waived his, or gave all his time to Mr. Waltz, so time has come. Here, we got to first read my official. In closing, we want to thank our witnesses for their testimony. I now yield to Ranking Member Garcia for his closing remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to just end this hearing with some of the comments I made earlier, and just again show I'm just dismayed and disappointed that we are choosing to spend our time this way. I do thank our witnesses, but I think I'm going to do a quick, brief summary of what we've already heard. One, a member chose to use this time to argue that members of right-wing militias should serve in our armed services. That's pretty outrageous. A witness, Mr. Lohmeyer, called the slogan Black Lives Matter a monument to Marxism, which is also pretty outrageous. The same witness claimed that he speaks for all service members, and I just want to note for the record, having talked to many service members before my time in Congress, and today I can say with certainty that he does not speak for all service members, particularly on issues of diversity and inclusion. We had a comparison of also that slogan to military bases named after people who took up arms to destroy our nation to preserve slavery was discussed. Members decided to relitigate the Vietnam War, which was interesting. We heard anti-vax propaganda, which continues to cost lives in this country. We heard cherry-picked anecdotes from a right-wing ideologue who personally and baselessly attacked members of this committee, speaking to one of our witnesses. The idea that our work today upholds national security is, in my opinion, a joke and crazy. And General, I do want to thank you once again for your clear and insightful testimony. Here are some of the facts. We need to harness the talents of every American, especially in a difficult recruiting environment. That means we need a climate that welcomes people of all backgrounds, that actively combats bigotry and extremism, and then makes all service members ensure that they are protected and supported. I just want to say finally that the arguments being made by two of our witnesses and some of the majority, as a reminder, those arguments have already lost. We are in a diverse military today. Those are arguments of the past. No matter how many times you come forward, write a book, give testimony, or try to move us backwards, you have failed. The Army is diverse, our military is diverse, and the United States will continue to be a place that welcomes diversity, inclusion, and that diversity is here to stay. And with that, I yield back.
Okay. I'd like to thank everyone for being here for today's committee. First of all, I'd like to thank Mr. Perry for pointing out that our military did not lose the war in Vietnam. Just a minor point. It was lost when Congress stopped giving aid to South Vietnam, but our military never did a tremendous job. To me, this is a very important committee and a very important hearing because our military has way too many people or way too much focused on race. And when they talk about diversity, they're not talking about who is musically inclined or who is tall or who came from North Dakota. They're talking about race. The head of the new Joint Chiefs has said that their goal should be 42% white officers, which means, in other words, that if you're the most qualified person, but you're a white guy, you're going to have a tough time, a tougher road to hoe. DEI is a Marxist ideology, and the reason it's Marxist is they want to destroy America and they want to divide America. And one way to divide America is to have everybody not identify as, say, Mr. Lohmeyer himself. They want him to identify, I don't even know what your ethnic background is, Mr. Lohmeyer, comma, Hispanic American, or Mr. Lohmeyer, comma, Native American. And the Marxists realize that once we get that in America, where everybody thinks every election or every promotion is a battle between ethnic groups, we have destroyed America. And that is where we are going. I wish I would have brought up earlier, like I said, that new head of the Joint Chiefs says a goal should be 42% white officers. In other words, she's outright saying that we are going to discriminate against you because you're a white guy. She's outright saying that the person who gets the promotion is not necessarily going to be the best person for the job. And inevitably, it's going to create divisions within the military because it causes people to say, I should be promoted because of my background. Furthermore, this diversity thing, I suppose in some ways diversity is okay, but in other ways, I don't see what it has to do with anything. Okay, if we have two people applying for the Air Force Academy who both grew up in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, lived on the same block, both played on the football team, both played saxophone in the school band, but one of them has a Hispanic grandfather. Well, all of a sudden, in order to increase diversity, that's the guy who's got to be promoted first, with the idea that they have diverse backgrounds or would bring something different to the military because one guy happened to have a grandfather who was born in Mexico 100 years ago is preposterous. But that is the ideology that is being pushed today and will inevitably destroy the military and will inevitably destroy America. So I'd like to thank you three folks for being here. I do not believe that forever, I sure hope Mr. Garcia is not right, forever we're in a position in which we define people by where their great-grandparents come from and believe that if this is not true, but if my grandfather was from Mexico, I don't speak Spanish, I've never been to Mexico in my life, but somehow, therefore, I have a unique viewpoint that I have to be promoted against other people in the military. That's ridiculous, and it's scary, and it's absurd. And I wish more people would say it, and I wish they'd call out people on what exactly they mean by diversity. How because I have an ancestor born in Thailand or something, it makes me a better sergeant. It's just absurd, but that's the ridiculous ideology that's taken over America. Okay, now with that and without objection, all members have 5 legislative days within which to submit materials and additional written questions for the witnesses, which will be forwarded to the witnesses if there are no further business. Without objection, I can't believe that people think it matters where my ancestors come from when we promote somebody. But okay, without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned. Thank you for all being here. You see that, don't you?
I love that at the end he turns to Mr. Garcia. You see that, don't you? You see how absurd this is? That's hilarious. The problem is Mr. Garcia does not see that. He does not see it at all. It's crazy. And that's what's so frustrating about all of this, right? Is you have this really great conversation and I'm not going to speak for everybody on the left, but certainly Mr. Garcia, I think he tuned out the whole thing. He just was not willing to even listen to what anybody was saying. He wasn't even willing to see the other side of it and make any concessions that there might be something to what everybody else was saying. So I agree. The insanity of it hurts your head. It hurts my head too. It is crazy. But anyways, that is that. So Surprisingly, we don't have anything scheduled for tomorrow. Oh, well, I don't. Congress may, but I have a couple things I've got to do tomorrow, so I won't be here tomorrow. I do want to try and find a time to stream the hearing from yesterday. Like I said, it's a really long one. It's an 8-hour one, but it's a good one. It's like bring your popcorn good. So maybe if I'm able to, I'll do it Sunday. I'm not sure. But we'll see. I'll take a look at my schedule and I'll post it as soon as I know, because man, that's going to be a fun one to watch together. Like I said, bring your popcorn, bring your Twizzlers, bring your soda. Like it's an event. It's like watching the gladiators. It's crazy. So thank you guys so much for being here with me. It was a lot shorter than I thought. I figured that would have a lot more arguing back and forth, but it's crazy. All right. Well, let me find a good song to take us out on, and I will see you guys soon. So I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I will talk to you later. Bye.
Gold and my heart and soul shoes, and walk among the groups of two. It's not our deal, it's just how we feel. It's a shame we're easily amused.